What happens when revolution turns its fury not just on kings, but on the women caught in its path in the convulsions of the French Revolution? The streets of Paris became a stage not just for justice, but for humiliation. Public shaming was wielded as a political weapon, particularly against women perceived as loyal to the ancien regime or resistant to the fervor of revolutionary change. What began as a cry for bread and justice often devolved into ritualized displays of vengeance during the March on Versailles in October 1789. Thousands of women stormed the royal palace demanding food and reform. Though they were hailed as heroines of the revolution, that same revolutionary tide would later turn against other women, especially those of noble birth. Female courtiers and aristocratic women suspected of royalist ties were dragged before hostile crowds, often jeered at and insulted, their dignity stripped as publicly as their titles. These women had no place to hide, as the very streets they had marched upon in hopes of justice became the stage for their undoing. In the grim procession to the guillotine, women such as Madame Roland, a prominent Girondin intellectual, were transported in open tumbrils, carts designed to maximize public exposure as they passed through Paris sans-culotte. Spectators mocked them, hurling insults and epithets. This was not simply transportation, it was a spectacle of degradation, a final ritual before death, meant to erase any remnants of aristocratic pride. Even in the final moments of their lives, these women were denied dignity, as their names and titles were dragged through the mud. Public humiliation was their final punishment, and their bodies were stripped of any symbol of their former identity as they passed through the streets. The revolution had not only claimed their lives, but had also sought to erase any memory of their aristocratic past and reduce them to mere objects of scorn. Punishment extended beyond execution. Women denounced as counter-revolutionary were often subjected to symbolic acts of humiliation, head shaving and forced undressing. To their shifts and being paraded as cautionary examples, these actions, conducted in broad daylight, reflected the revolution's darker inclination toward street-level justice, where moral retribution blurred with public cruelty. The goal was not just to punish, but to publicly disgrace and destroy the very identity of these women by stripping them of their dignity and subjecting them to public ridicule. The revolution turned women into symbols of fear and rage. The humiliations they endured were not only about justice, but also about power and control. The revolution had become a machine that consumed its own, and women were particularly vulnerable to this insatiable force. As the revolution radicalized, it wasn't just tyrants who were targeted, but anyone, especially any woman, who stood on the wrong side of public opinion. Women were perceived as either allies of the revolution or enemies of progress, and anyone suspected of the latter could find themselves victims of the vengeful crowds. Even women who once supported the revolution could be torn apart by the forces they had helped to create. The shifting political tides in revolutionary France meant that loyalty could be a fleeting thing. Women were often left exposed, caught in the crossfire of political maneuvering with little recourse for protection. Their fates were sealed by the whims of the people and the harsh judgment of the Fae. Revolution's leaders, one moment they could be hailed as heroes of the revolution, the next they were seen as enemies of the state, a sharp reminder of how fickle power could be and how easily it could turn against those who had once been its champions. These women became symbols of a deeper issue. The revolution had unleashed a wave of political fervor that tore through society with little regard for the lives it destroyed. The revolution's fervor was so powerful that it began to consume not just the monarchs and their loyalists, but also the very people it claimed to protect. The marginalized women found themselves particularly vulnerable as they were forced to navigate a political landscape that was unforgiving and brutal. The lines between friend and foe were constantly shifting, and women were often left with no clear place to stand. Those who had once been part of the movement now found themselves its victims. This shifting allegiance created an environment of fear where no one was safe, and the slightest suspicion could result in public humiliation and death. Women were often seen not just as victims of circumstance, but as symbols of a past that had been violently erased by the revolution. Their execution and public humiliation served as a warning to others who might dare to stand in opposition to the new order of things. The revolution had promised liberty and equality, but for women it often delivered only violence and shame. Their bodies became battlegrounds for a struggle that had little regard for their humanity and little desire to recognize their agency in the face of such brutal oppression. Women were reduced to symbols of aristocratic corruption or counter-revolutionary thought. Their suffering became political, and their fate was sealed by the forces of public opinion. Their pain and degradation were used to justify the revolution's ongoing violence, as the demands for justice were replaced by demands for vengeance. The revolution consumed those it was supposed to protect. These acts of public humiliation were not without precedent in revolutionary movements, but the French Revolution's focus on women as symbols of aristocratic corruption made their suffering particularly intense. It was not just their political beliefs that were questioned, but their very identity as women in a society that had long been dominated by men. Women's bodies became battlegrounds on which the future of France was fought. Their dignity was stripped away in front of the very people they had once been sworn to protect. The revolution had become a force of retribution, where the suffering of women was not only expected, but also necessary for the cause. Their humiliation was not merely incidental, but essential to the performance of revolutionary justice. It was through their degradation that the revolution sought to cleanse itself of its past mistakes and to establish a new order that demanded absolute loyalty from all citizens, regardless of gender. The humiliation of women during the French Revolution was not just about power, it was also about control. The revolution sought to create a new society, one where old structures were destroyed and new ones were built upon the rubble, but in the process women were often discarded as unnecessary victims of a changing world. Their bodies became symbols of a political struggle that had no place for them. They were not just silenced but also erased from the narrative of the revolution. Their voices were drowned out by the cries of revolutionaries seeking justice, but in the end it was women who paid the price for the revolution's fervor as their bodies were paraded through the streets and their names erased from history. Their suffering became a testament to the true cost of political upheaval and the terrible consequences of revolution's fury when it turned on its own. During the French Revolution, women found themselves subjected to both public humiliation and private suffering behind the iron bars of revolutionary prisons. As the revolution unfolded, thousands of women, both noble and common, were forced to endure unimaginable conditions in overcrowded cells where fear, neglect, and uncertainty reigned. The conciergerie, once a royal palace, became infamous as an antechamber to the guillotine where prisoners awaited their fate. The conditions were deplorable. Cells designed for a handful of people were often packed with thrice their number. Basic sanitation was nearly non-existent, and the smell of illness hung in the air as disease spread unchecked. But perhaps the worst part of their imprisonment was the suffocating uncertainty. Each day was lived in fear that the next would bring the final, irreversible moment. Among the many prisons where women were detained during the Reign of Terror, La Force and Sainte-Pélagie became notorious for their inhumane treatment of female prisoners. The sweeping law of suspects, enacted in 1793, broadened the definition of enemies of the revolution, resulting in mass arrests. Women of aristocratic background, those suspected of ties to emigrants, or even those with insufficient revolutionary fervor, were deemed a threat. As the system struggled to handle the influx of prisoners, conditions worsened. Prison cells were packed beyond capacity, and the misery of daily life became unbearable. The horrors of these prisons are partially captured in the memoirs of Grace Dalrymple Elliott, a Scottish noblewoman who was imprisoned during this dark chapter of history. In her writings, she describes the stench, the overwhelming fear, and the agonizing roll call where each name read aloud could signal a death sentence. Unlike their male counterparts, who often shared political camaraderie, many of the women in these prisons were isolated from any allies. They were caught in a web of uncertainty, knowing that at any moment they could face judgment and execution, yet powerless to defend themselves or seek justice. The revolutionary prisons were more than just places of physical confinement. They were sites of profound psychological torment. The ever-present fear of execution was a weight that crushed the spirits of the women imprisoned there. Isolation only deepened the terror they faced as they were left to dwell on their fate in solitude. Revolutionary justice, swift and unforgiving, left no room for defense. Women accused of crimes against the revolution were subjected to long periods of uncertainty, waiting in dark cells, their minds filled with the haunting sounds of other prisoners' suffering. They could hear the cries of those who had been executed, knowing their own end might be drawing near. Despite this constant pressure, many women held firm, refusing to betray their beliefs or their families. They stood as symbols of resistance against a system that cared little for their lives. Interrogations under revolutionary tribunals were often psychologically brutal, as women were coerced into confessions under the threat of execution. Although physical torture had been officially abolished in France by 1788, the authorities found other means to extract confessions. Interrogators relied on psychological pressure, manipulating prisoners with promises of leniency, only to turn those promises into threats when the women refused to cooperate. The tribunals were designed to deliver justice swiftly, but in reality, the proceedings often felt like mere formalities, with outcomes already determined before the prisoners had a chance to speak. Outside the prisons, public opinion played a powerful role in sentencing. Newspapers like L'Ami du Peuple and revolutionary posters vilified women before their trials even began. The court of public opinion convicted them first, ensuring that by the time they entered a courtroom, they were already seen as guilty in the eyes of the people. Justice became secondary to performance. Confessions were often made not out of guilt but out of fear, exhaustion, and the crushing pressure to comply with revolutionary expectations. Women were punished not just for their actions, but for their very existence. Many were simply targeted because of their former status in a now vanquished world. The September massacres of 1792 stand as a particularly brutal moment in the revolution's blood-soaked history. The prisons of Paris, once sites of suffering, became scenes of wholesale slaughter. Between September 2nd and 6th, over 1,000 prisoners were killed in a wave of violence sparked by rumors of counter-revolutionary plots. Among the victims were dozens of women, many of whom were accused of supporting the monarchy or the church. These were not formal executions, they were mob killings, carried out by citizens who believed they were defending the revolution. Women, including the elderly and infirm, were dragged from their cells, condemned without trial, and dispatched with whatever crude weapons were at hand. Among the most memorable victims were the Carmelite nuns of Compiègne, who were executed in 1794. They had been arrested for refusing to comply with the revolution's secularization of the church, and their death, like those of many others, became a symbol of the revolution's war on religion. In contrast, the women killed during the September massacres remain largely nameless, their stories lost in the chaos of the mob. This marked a chilling moment when revolutionary justice gave way to panic and vengeance, and the lives of women were seen as expendable. By October 1793, the revolution had consumed its monarchy, and its gaze turned on the former queen, Marie Antoinette. After the execution of her husband, Louis XVI, in January of the same year, Marie Antoinette was reduced to the status of the widow caput, stripped of her royal title and her dignity. Her trial was swift, politically motivated. and marked by absurd charges, including an accusation of incest with her son. The trial was a spectacle, designed not to find justice, but to further humiliate the monarchy. The once elaborate rituals of Versailles had been replaced by the harsh realities of prison, and her final moments were spent in strict solitude, awaiting her inevitable execution. The fate of these women serves as a haunting reminder of the dangers of revolutionary justice. When power shifts violently, it is often the most vulnerable who suffer the most. These women, both victims and symbols, bore the weight of the revolution's fear and rage, their suffering serving as a political statement. In their imprisonment and death, they became casualties of a movement that promised liberty and equality but ultimately devoured its own.